Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to another in our video chat series for the Half Earth Project Educator Ambassadors. I'm really pleased with to be able to welcome Christy Morrissey of the University of Saskatchewan this morning. And Christy has agreed to come on to talk a little bit, to provide a little bit of context for thinking about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. An extremely important and influential book. And I think that Christy is in just a great position to discuss the book a little bit, give us some context, because she's doing very relevant research, current research that is relates in some ways to things that Rachel Carson wrote about all those many decades ago. And so we're gonna have a great conversation this morning. I wanna say hi to Christy. How are you doing?
Good morning. Hi, I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for, I know it's pretty early there, your time, and I really appreciate you making the time for this conversation. I'd like to start out just by asking, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, you know, who you are and what the short version of your career path to what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, that you mentioned. I have a cross appointment in a couple of different units, which reflects some of the diversity of my interests and training. So I'm in biology, but I also have an appointment in the School of Environment and Sustainability, which is a very interdisciplinary school. And I also am an associate member in toxicology, which deeply reflects my specific training as an eco-toxicologist.
Really interesting. I have to say, yeah, wetland is not the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Saskatchewan.
Yeah, it's an amazing landscape. It's kind of this neat place because you think of it as just kind of vast open prairie with grasslands, but the whole landscape is dotted with these prairie pothole wetlands, which are real hotspots for biodiversity. So there are millions of pothole wetlands throughout the landscape, and these happen to be often embedded directly in agriculture. So there is kind of a conflict there where we have sort of a mission and interest for conservation of wildlife and biodiversity, but we're also in a very industrialized working landscape.
Right. And when you say industrialized, primarily you mean the scale and methods of the agriculture that's going on in that region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things when I first moved to Saskatchewan, I was just blown away by the size of a so-called field. So a field in Saskatchewan is 160 acres. So
wow.
It's
like a county
half a mile. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a half a mile by a half a mile.
yeah.
That's one field with one crop. And for many farmers, they call those quarter sections, by the way. So for many farmers, they have farms that farm 40, 80, 100 of those quarter sections.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an amazing, the scale of everything is just mind-blowing.
Was Silent Spring something that you were, as a book, Rachel Carson's thinking, was that something in your training and in your mind, or was it something that you kind of returned to when you moved to Saskatchewan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've certainly known about Silent Spring throughout my, career, and as a graduate student, I recall picking it up and sort of superficially, I think, reading it. Um, and once I started working more on pesticides and the issues that sort of I guess capture what people think Silent Spring is, I did pick the book up again about 10 years ago and really just read it in depth. I now actually teach with that book.
Hmm.
As well, because I think, and the response I've gotten from students is they really appreciate really reading it. because it's so much more than what you think it is.
Hmm.
And she was such a revolutionary scientist. And so in many ways, both personally and professionally, I really admire what she did, what Rachel Carson did in writing that book. But there are so many parallels and so many things that are current today, even though that book was written more than 50 years ago. What I do is I have a set of chapters. I think there's about 6 chapters that are, scattered through the book. I encourage students, of course, to read the whole thing. I mean,
Yeah.
and many do actually. The feedback I get is that the book is actually really easy to read.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's kind of entertaining. It's very, it's almost poetic in some parts for sure. But it's written for, common people. It's not a heavy
Yeah.
scientific journal or anything like that.
Right.
And, so I have students read about 6 chapters throughout the book. And then we have discussion groups about those discussion questions and form groups around, what was she thinking, or why was this written? But importantly, I also get the students to relate it to current day.
Hmm.
So, where are the parallels? And it's remarkable how current it really is. And students will tell me this, that, this is many of the topics that are brought up from not just sort of pesticides and birds, which is sort of what everybody assumes it's about, but, aspects around, intensification of agriculture, about chemical use and sort of mainstreaming chemical use, and about monocultures, or planting large vast areas of both forests as well as agricultural settings in a single species, and sort of the risks around doing those activities. And so she was very aware early on about, how we're changing the environment and what those consequences would be, probably well before anybody actually had studied those
Right.
consequences. So I think that was really insightful, and still,
Right.
again, very relevant today.
Yeah, seem to really anticipate and frame things well. I have to say also, because what you were saying about how it's a great general read, and I'm particularly impressed because she doesn't shy away from showing you some chemical formulas and talking in a specific way about the known properties of chemicals, some of the known physiology, and yet does it in that way that's just a very readable light touch.
Absolutely. I mean, most of us are very familiar with the kind of the DDT story,
Right.
and how it impacted, raptors, for example, through shell thinning. That kind of story is what people associate, the book about. But as you read it, you actually, it's much more than just that scientific story that we, sure, she puts those formulas in and they're there, but she really does talk about, chemicals moving long distances, carrying on clouds. And yeah, much of the text is very, very entertaining and interesting way to present it.
Yeah.
And, there wasn't a lot at that time modeling that. We don't,
Hmm.
you can imagine at that time, there wasn't a lot of opinion pieces being written, or, entertaining sort of science writing was not a thing, right? This was one of the famous quotes in her book that I really like. And, it says, "Why would anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for life?" And, I think that moves me really deeply, because she wasn't afraid to say the truth about, what these chemicals were. They are poisons. They're the only legal poison that you're allowed to put out in the environment,
Mm.
in vast
In
quantities,
such
right?
quantity.
Yeah. And so, she was really drawing to, the public's attention, both back then and now, that these are poisons, and we're putting them out there in large amounts to kill things. That is really their role. Now they have advantages, no question. You know,
Hmm.
chemicals have advanced our our ability to combat pests, to grow more food, to improve our agricultural system in many ways that have been positive. But of course, indiscriminate use, as what
Hmm.
she's describing it, or without thought, um, certainly can result in these consequences of making it unfit for life.
Right. And these things are, I think it probably surprised most people to know how little studied the whole spectrum of all these chemicals is, and how actually, you know, trying to use the most neutral word possible, but how unregulated, in fact, many of these uses are. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, we do have a system, well, particularly in, the Western world, of regulating pesticides, but, it's still pretty, it's certainly not as advanced as what people think it is. And I
Hmm.
guess one of the messages I tend to share with my students, and I share with audiences, is the fact that pesticides are actually tested by the chemical companies who produce them. So, in order for a pesticide to become registered, they provide the toxicity data that they deem appropriate to the regulators, who review that and then determine if the chemical is safe enough for use. And I think both you and I know what that's maybe not an ideal situation. And I'm not saying that all of the data they produce is wrong or incorrect or
Right.
garbage, but there are problems with it,
Yeah.
and this is how we keep getting ourselves into traps with certain chemicals that are controversial, is that they get registered for use, and then we play catch up with independent scientists like myself for many years later to try and refute that safety, or to prove that it's wrong. So it's or that there's harm, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
When in fact we could have done that at the outset. The
Right.
scale is huge. So I mentioned about the size of fields in Saskatchewan. Well, by the way, Saskatchewan's sort of the middle of Canada there, in that very dark northern area. So this is, that's the Prairie Pothole region. So of
Yeah.
Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan is the central province that has the highest pesticide use in Canada. And also because it's the most agriculturally intensive area of Canada. So, there are 379 million hectares, or almost 42% of the land surface in the US is agricultural land.
Stunning.
And in Canada, we have a smaller fraction, but of course, that's because we're a very large landmass in Canada, much of which is, not really developed at all in northern Canada. But nonetheless, there is a very large proportion of North America that is covered in agricultural land. So I
Hmm.
kind of think of this is the habitat for biodiversity, for example. And, this vast expanse of habitat, we as humans are controlling. So most of us kind of think about habitat as, these wild spaces
Right.
in parks and so on. But wildlife don't really know about that. So they don't have a park permit, and they will go wherever there is the things they need, which is food and other resources. And in many cases, agricultural land is habitat for a lot of species. In fact, there are we've done work that there's over 70 species of birds that are in North America that are directly tied to agricultural farmlands. So that is their main, they regularly occur and breed in farmland habitat. The amount of pesticides we're using is pretty high.
Yeah.
I've given some statistics there for you to look at,
Right.
but it is pretty high.
Billions of pounds and 6,000 registered products. So many different chemical products to really understand and keep track of. It was an interesting point you made about the 70 bird species. So in some ways, some of these species may have responded to our modification of the landscape, which has made it, in some respects, an attractive habitat, as you first mentioned, either food source, water source, home, the various things they look for that they're adapted to in their environment. And yet at the same time, then these other practices are damaging these very populations that in some ways we've drawn to these lands because of our initial modification of the land.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are winners and losers.
Yeah.
And some species are definitely taking advantage of the fact that we have in some cases put free food out there, for example, or created an environment that is advantageous for them. But there are also losers who, many people describe this as an ecological trap. So what that means is just that, animals are attracted to these areas because they look good, right? So on the surface, on the storefront, it's, free food, easy to get, looks nice, right? And you walk in the store or go and start to breed in these agricultural environments, and it turns out it's not so good, right? There's these hidden dangers, for example, with pesticides that potentially could kill you or reduce your food supply in ways that are really damaging, but you didn't know about it when you showed up. There are these two very distinct ways, and most people are less aware of this indirect effects. So this is where, birds, many species, particularly the aerial insectivores. So I've pictured here a barn swallow, kind of a classic agricultural or farmland bird, who are highly dependent on insect prey. And of course, insecticides are produced to kill or reduce populations of insects. That's their job. And so they're very effective at that. And most insecticides are designed to be broad spectrum. Well, that just means that they're designed to kill a wide variety of insects indiscriminately. So it doesn't choose whether those are good insects.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know of a insecticide that kills only
whatever it is that's eating your particular crop.
Yeah, just aphids or just whatever. They don't have a chemical like that. And so they kill the broad spectrum of insects, and many of them are important prey for insectivorous birds like swallows. There are other kind of pesticides like the herbicides that can also reduce the vegetative cover. So, herbicides kill plants. They're designed to kill plants indiscriminately. And of course, if you spray, herbicides like glyphosate or 2,4-D, these are very common herbicides, over vegetative areas, including overspray in areas where you aren't cropped but can be kind of important habitat for birds. You could inadvertently make their nests more visible if they're a ground nesting species, or you could even just reduce the amount of this non-crop vegetation that actually is important for harboring those insects as well. So the combination is called indirect effects to birds, because we're not killing birds outright with the chemical, but because it influences their prey or their habitat in ways that are not good, we can have problems.
So that's interesting because, of course, again, the scale of this of the monoculture, the single crop agriculture, you've done this physical and mechanical manipulation of the fields, of the environment. And then in a way, it sounds like, you know, insecticides, pesticides, herbicides are compounding that effect, because they're even reducing any plant other than the desired crop plant. It's making it more difficult for them to grow there.
Right.
So it's amplifying that initial
Right.
mechanical effect.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, and I think for many people, we assume that it's all sort of pests and crop that are, you know, that there's this deep, just a competition, right? Or
Right, right.
and pests, remember, are weeds as well as insects. But
Yeah,
actually, many things are also out there that are not just the pest and the crop, right?
right.
And that's we now have more science that's actually saying that biodiversity is actually helping the crop
Yep.
in many ways. And so that's kind of an exciting area of research that's needing more attention now.
I love that. Right. So, yeah, I think we'll develop that idea a little bit toward the end here. So now, and then we'll go into some of the direct effects. Do you want me to go ahead and go
Sure.
through
Yeah,
those?
you can
Jill?
open that that sort of pathway up. I think the idea here is that, you know, what we often think about, and this is, you know, much of what Rachel Carson was famous for, was, you know, the understanding that, you know, if we spray these vast amounts of chemicals, or we use the chemicals in different forms, in the form of granules or treated seeds, and I'll talk about that in a second. Essentially, we expose birds directly to the chemical. They'll eat it, for example, or they'll come in contact with it on their skin. And that is a particular problem for small birds, because the amount of chemical that they need to ingest in order to get a lethal dose or even a sublethal dose is usually very small. You know, a small little sparrow, for example, the white-crowned sparrow there, you know, only weighs about 27 grams.
Mhm.
So the dose, what we call the dose, makes the poison. That whole concept is driven by the fact that you need to ingest a certain amount for your body size, right? So most of us know this when we take a medication. You know, you're told to take 1 pill or 2 pills. This has been calculated a dose that's correct for your body size. Well, when birds are exposed to pesticides, they're exposed to these chemicals, regardless of the fact that they're just a small bird, and they're getting a fairly high dose for their body size. So an example for treated seeds that have a neonicotinoid coating, so that is one of the most controversial, yeah, those pink seeds there. That's one of the most controversial set of chemicals, and they've been in the news for you know, a few years now, and we've done lots of research on these chemicals. You know, a bird that consumes an imidacloprid or neonicotinoid treated seed only needs to eat, for example, 1/10 of a corn seed
Wow.
to get a lethal dose, or maybe even just a few canola seeds that will give them this lethal dose. So it's a tiny amount that they need to actually be lethal, and yet we're putting these out, these seeds, for example, treated or covered in the pesticide, and birds don't know that they are a problem, right? So
Right.
they'll eat them, and that can cause them to be sick or die,
I think you
which
have that
is,
in, yeah, you actually have. So
yeah.
it's so important, as we were talking about originally with Rachel Carson. She, of course, had some evidence, but partly what you're saying, in 50 years, we really have some careful studies, including this work by you. So um, direct
Yeah,
evidence.
my yeah, that's right. Direct evidence that these things are harmful. So this is a slide from some work that my very talented postdoc Margaret Eng and colleagues did using white-crowned sparrows. We experimentally exposed them to a neonicotinoid in a captive setting. So these were wild birds. We captured them. acclimated them for just a few days, and these were migratory birds, so they were on migration. And for those of you who don't know, the key factor for birds on migration is when they stop. Often they do stop in these agricultural fields to fuel up. It's kind of like stopping at the gas station and fueling up.
Yeah,
so they're there to fuel up and eat, right?
They're on a marathon, right?
They're on a marathon, flying thousands of kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So the idea is that they are really at their maximum weight, or they should be, and then when they've got enough fuel, they set off and fly again. So we captured them, brought them into captivity for just a short window, and we exposed them to 3 daily doses of the chemical that would mimic something like what they would get if they were in the, foraging in a farm field, and maybe got a tiny dose. So the top line, the black line, is the body mass of our controls. So those are the birds that, were not exposed to the chemical, but were treated exactly the same as all the others. And you can see they basically stay the same weight throughout the 3 days. There's a slight dip there, but it's not significant.
Not significant, right? A slight loss of weight.
A slight loss of weight, but not significant. Sort of like a less than half a gram. But the birds in the low and the high dose group lost 17% or 25%. That is a quarter of their body weight in 3 days.
Right.
Just from being exposed to a tiny dose. And I think I have a little picture there of, if you go one more, there's a little picture of a, which we may or may not be able to see behind.
I've tried to move
shining faces
video windows, and the recording will push it back. But anyways.
That's fine. But there's a tiny, so there is a penny there,
right?
And there is a canola seed. There are 3 canola seeds hidden behind it.
Dozens of seeds could fit on that penny. Yeah.
Yes, and they only need to eat the equivalent of what we were giving them. We weren't feeding them seeds, but we were feeding them the actual chemical. But the equivalent we were giving them was about 3 or 4 of those treated seeds, of canola seeds, which, are tiny. And so just to give you a kind of sense that, these are really small amounts that birds need to get to see a massive effect. So it didn't, so this is important work.
Yeah. And so you're feeding them the chemical, and then they've lost this body mass, whether they're a control group or the dosed group, they're eating, they're feeding at will with food you're providing them to feed.
Yeah, we give them clean food throughout the whole experiment. It has nothing to do with food aversion.
Right.
They are all given clean food, clean water. We use a technique called oral gavage, which is basically just a way of describing that we actually give them a tiny amount in liquid into their crop directly, so that we don't confound the taste or the aversion to being, sometimes birds can feel sick and then they associate the food with being sick, just like people do. And so we remove all of that. And so we see this kind of major loss in body mass. And we've also found that we did, as part of this experiment, we also found that birds essentially fell out of migratory condition. So they no longer oriented in the correct direction northward. They became disoriented in these trials, and essentially just they sort of no longer are capable of undergoing correct migration at that point.
So that's really
it has consequences.
Right. And now, and of course, you don't know, you haven't yet done the further study to find out whether that could be a direct neurological effect, or whether it's simply if you lose that much weight, you become weak, disoriented, unable to.
Yeah, well, we have done some of this follow-up studies that have given us hints at that, and we're doing actually experiments now to directly look at the effects on the brain. But one of the experiments we did as a follow-up was we actually captured birds, the same species, gave them just a single dose, and then we released them with a radio tag on.
Wow.
And this was really exciting because we were able to see how long the birds took to leave the site after they've been exposed to the chemical. And we also were able to tell whether they flew in the correct direction, because we released them in an area of southern Ontario where there's this MODIS telemetry network. So there's a series of radio towers that can detect the birds, and we can kind of track then where they went. And as it turns out, those birds that were dosed with a chemical, and in fact we used, by the way, for that free living experiment, half the doses of what we used here.
Wow.
So our low became our high. And that low dose, which in this case caused 17% body mass, birds also lost weight again. We only held them for 6 hours, but they lost weight, lost fat very rapidly. And when we release them, they actually don't leave. They stay at the stopover site for, on average, 3.5 days longer than the controls, some birds up to 8 days longer, presumably to regain the body mass. And then when they do fly in the correct direction. And so it turns out, we think that this is primarily not necessarily a neurological effect, just the fact that they lose so much body weight, it's almost like just an engine gets turned off.
Right.
They will no longer choose to depart on migration for the next leg of their journey until they've completely recovered. I mean, I get this question all the time, right? Because it's often such a doom and gloom story. And I think Rachel Carson didn't shy away from that either. She said it was a doom and gloom story too. She presented it that way, but she also presented some optimism and solutions. And I think this is there are a lot of things that I've learned over the years in doing this research that are very important. So the first one is that, single chemical bans are not very effective. So when we think about, okay, which is the worst culprit, I showed you at the beginning how many pesticide products, for example, are registered in Canada. We have like 6,000. Okay. Yeah. So, we pick on certain chemicals like, say, the neonicotinoids, and we think, well, if we ban those ones, it'll be fine. The problem is that we've already done this research on some of the replacement chemicals for the neonicotinoids. And it turns out that actually there are, at least six different chemicals that are already in widespread use. And we know 2 of them in particular are more toxic to insects than imidacloprid, which is the worst of the neonicotinoids. And these are already kind of being rolled out. We're detecting them in water, in surface waters, in wetlands. They're already in widespread use. And so, it's just a game of, taking one out, but we replace it with like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 more. And so single chemical bans are not that effective. And I sort of say, don't really put all your energy into that. It's great if you want to champion the ban in your region or your area for a particular chemical, but that's not necessarily the best use of our energy. The next thing I think that would be better off is think about organic or where your food is grown, right? And many people think organic is the future. Well, organic is super, but organic is a label, and it's definitely got all of the good features because it's grown without pesticides. But not all pesticides are bad, and that's not the only way we can get safe food, quality food. There's actually a new movement now called regenerative agriculture. It goes by lots of different names, by the way, but regenerative agriculture, if you want to Google that or look it up, regenerative agriculture is a really exciting
That's great.
sort of means of variety of practices and techniques that farmers can apply on their farm, and in certain contexts. They can integrate their livestock better into crop fields to control weeds and fertilize the ground. They can use intercropping or different species of crops in the same area. They can use cover crops where they put in one crop and just it sort of fertilizes or keeps the ground covered so there's less weeds. All of these things reduce their chemical use, but they also have a huge number of gains for improving soil health, to improving biodiversity. They get usually bigger, better crops out of it. So it's a real win-win. And it's less focused on, chemical versus no chemical, but it's about producing a really strong, healthy ecosystem that produces food, but also has these knock-on benefits for biodiversity, for example.
That's great.
The third one is about collaboration. And I think, I've learned a lot over the years now working with different stakeholders, but mostly working with farmers, that they are part of the solution. And really all of us are part of the solution. We need to collaborate a lot more on projects that, start at a local level or, are on a single farm. And that kind of collaboration between different people with different expertise. For example, in my own work, I'm collaborating with farmers to have them implement some of these, regenerative or positive practices on their farms, and I'll come in and study it. So, and they like that because, they don't really know what is good or bad about what they're doing, but farmers are natural experimenters. I mean, I don't know a farmer that doesn't experiment every year. The problem is they don't have controls and they don't do it in a scientific way. And so I try to teach them how to do it in a scientific way that we can study. And that kind of is just an example of collaboration, but there's lots of examples of how we should be collaborating more to bring about change and solutions, because we really all bring strengths and we all have that knowledge. And even in another setting, it's about collaborating with different types of scientists. So economists working with working together with biodiversity scientists or water quality scientists. We have a lot to gain from working in an interdisciplinary way to really solve big problems.
That's great.
And then the last one is kind of pointing the finger to say that consumers, us, right? What we buy, what we eat, what we choose has a big role to play. And I think a lot of the big chains, and I don't know if I should name the chains here, but places like Walmart or A&W or McDonald's or whatever, they are all onto this. And they know that consumers are wanting to know that their food is grown sustainably.
So we have influence on these big companies.
Huge influence, huge. And people don't realize it, but what you buy or what you say you will buy, for example, is really playing a big role in shifting the sort of conversation. I'll give a good example. Cheerios, everybody knows about Cheerios and their sort of bee campaign. So Cheerios has invested a lot into moving towards regenerative agriculture. And they are actually trying to get all their oat growers to be growing their oats using regenerative agriculture over the next 5 to 10 years. And they're working directly with them and helping them fund some of the changes and training and everything. So they're doing this not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart, but frankly, because people will buy a cereal that has a bee on its box. So consumers are actually what are driving everything going forward down to the field and how it's grown. So we have a lot of control over that. And I think once people realize that, that we do have control, it kind of gives you a sense like, yeah, I could actually do something about this problem.
Yeah, and not too. Well, I'm gonna leave on that positive note of encouragement and sign off and want to thank you so much. This has been, I love doing these because, there's an example where I've really learned a lot. And so I'm sure the students and educators will feel the same way. So thank you so much. And I'm going to keep track of your excellent work. Thank you, Christy.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.